word evangelical has become a four-letter word, and for many good reasons. But in many parts of the country still, a lot of folks who would identify as evangelical, say as an adjective, they are in many ways at both the forefront of and in most sustained commitment to serving refugees. In particular, Catholic nuns are sort of saving the border crisis in many ways.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Elaine Howard Eklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Today, my conversation is with journalist Ann Snyder. Ann currently serves as editor-in-chief of Comment magazine. Comment is one of the core publications of Cardis, a think tank devoted to Christian social thought, and is also host of the Whole Person Revolution podcast. Ann, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Our pleasure.
I want to talk to you today about immigration, but more broadly about politics and current divisions in our country too. And of course, it's hard right now to jump in because we have such a clear example of a division after the insurrection and the riots at the Capitol on January 6th. And so given just everything that's going on in this public moment, what's coming to mind for you, or what are some of the things that are really striking you right now?
I live, like I'm talking to you right now, 10 blocks from the Capitol. And so like living in all of that while my work is so oriented towards trying to, I don't think first politically. Politics for me is just like always a symptom of these deeper, often very confusing, difficult to sort out cultural, even I would say spiritual things that are going on out in the country at large. So I think meta questions of like, can our liberal institutions stand up to, do they have the moral mettle anymore to stand up to like increasingly illiberal populations, to, is this just like the last death rattle of white supremacy? American Christianity clearly has its work cut out for itself. So this sort of like themes that I actually think in weird ways are intertwined with one another, but the sense of deep disturb and kind of, I think, both exhaustion as well as like awakening to this being a capstone of all that has been revealed, especially in the last year in our various crises, but also the last number of years of greater and greater division and so on. Both the church, frankly, that I'm a part of it globally, but also just people of goodwill who believe in such a thing as a beloved community. Could we perhaps manifest that in physical forms?
I know you're an expert on moral community and thinking about, things like what makes organizations flourish and institutional health. And I'm thinking about, what do our institutions need to do to both like learn from the community that folks have, but then also really provide for those so that, they are able to flourish through the whole life course. I mean, do you have any insights into that, from your own work? I've learned a lot from your work on organizational flourishing and what that means.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And I've actually been thinking about your question actually in the context of our nation right now, and even just sort of thinking about immigration specifically, and why are certain groups of folks in this country, at least by polling, so anti-outsiders. We're in such an Amerocentric moment right now because we're in a series of deep crisis on multiple fronts. I hope we don't just totally turn inward. And I say that in part because both the communities, and when I say community, I'm talking sometimes about, say, in the religious setting, an Anabaptist or Mennonite or Amish community, or certain kinds of rehab communities, but also institutional ones, schools, certain kind of neighborhood development organizations. You find that the healthiest organizations that are both keeping the members or those they're serving engaged, alight, growing as human beings, and relating in really grace-giving and grace-receiving ways with others, they tend to be fairly closed systems in the sense that they have a clear sense of telos and mission and sort of clear rituals. And there's like thick and identifiable moral life, but paired with this tension of being kind of open to outsiders. So, I mean, I'm thinking right now of a amazing kind of famously sort of pacifist community that continues to attract, I think, more and more young people. It's just called the Bruderhof, and they're actually all over the world. So the Bruderhof, and I'm not part of their community, so I'm sure I'll get it a little wrong, but they were founded actually 100 years ago by a pastor in Germany and wound up being beyond conscientious objectors to the pending Nazi regime. We're coming from an Anabaptist strain, which is typically sort of has a deeply nonviolent approach, but they're comprehensive communities that you sort of feel like you're in an Amish community. The women are in long skirts and headscarves. They don't really have a head figure pastor. They run their own businesses. They work the land, but it's really a witness. They're trying to be sort of, on the one hand, an enclosed kind of light on a hilltop that sort of witnesses to what they would call like a Sermon on the Mount Christian community, full stop. And yet they do drive cars, they do use phones, they are on YouTube, they're like open with technology. And it's just been interesting to learn how they're so open to hosting guests. And it's just like been fascinating to get to know a community that has such a thick moral identity and set of commitments, and yet they are not inward. They are like very outward. And I just feel like there's something about that is instructive for any organizations that's claiming to be some kind of an exemplar, or that's claiming to sort of transform people, their sort of moral core. So that it's a paradox. Like, how do you combine kind of an appreciation for pluralism with a thoroughgoing commitment to your roots? And again, this relates a little bit to immigrants, because I think a lot of immigrant families, these are the conversations they have with their kids as they age all the time. So, yeah.
And this is the conversation too that Americans are having right now. What does it mean to be American, and what does it mean to welcome outsiders and really be human, right? And have a human sensibility that we're all of our core humanness. Yeah, I really, you raised such good points that communities need to be welcoming, but also a community, cohesive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about immigration, maybe say a little bit about the work that you've done in the immigration space in the past.
Yeah. So in some ways, this is like the heart of my joy as being an American. I grew up overseas until I was 10 years old in Asia, and my mother grew up in Peru, South America. So I think just in my own family, I had this sort of both Latin and Asian influences culturally, and then so many other things. In my youth, even in the U.S., I was in a lot of immigrant communities. So fast forward, I was sort of always aware of policy debates around immigration, but I was probably much more interested in the texture of first, second, third generation, like processes of what it is to hold hybrid identities, and, questions of tradition and roots, and actually sort of moral values that can emanate. Certain cultures obviously are much more interdependent than ours and have way less bondage to time, or, those kinds of questions as manifesting in like delightful ethnic, cultural ways. How do you perpetuate the goods in a new country? Mm-hmm. And I think there's just, like many would think of the U.S. as a nation of immigrants. About a decade ago, I just started doing a lot more writing, not so much about those like crossing the border, although I wound up moving to Houston. I was interested in Houston specifically as kind of like the new Ellis Island in terms of the gateway to the U.S. from the world.
Maybe say a little bit more about that, especially since we're located in Houston. So we're always trying to get some kind of unique Houston angle here.
Well, you guys know more than I now. I left right before Harvey hit, so I feel in some ways it's probably a changed city, but Houston was just there was something in its hospitable posture towards the outsider. And even myself, though I wasn't an immigrant, I was sort of a domestic immigrant, I guess, coming from the East Coast when I moved there knowing nobody. And I just always found it to be a place that was so future oriented, and actually was very bullish on sort of the creativity that comes from friction and the creativity that comes from welcoming difference. And as I got to know the city better, I think it tends to sometimes overly puff itself up for being one of the most diverse cities in the country, but doesn't always handle that diversity justly across every policy area. I remember just sort of over time learning that, yes, it's very diverse, but that doesn't always mean that segregation doesn't still exist and siloing and so on.
I remember when you were here, you were doing a lot of work with collecting stories and understanding the landscape related to immigration. Are there stories that you heard then that seem particularly relevant now around immigration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was really interested in notions of agency, and community, and I was particularly interested in human development. And so I remember one vivid kind of, it was the perfect situation for a writer. I sort of happened upon an excerpt northwest of Houston, far out, very flat, and there was a trailer park. It was about 20 homes, and it was very well kept. There were roses, mowed lawns. There was a playing field for the kids. And interestingly, every single family that lived in this little trailer park had all come from the same village in Mexico and had lived in this park for 18 years or something. So barely a generation. And across the street was a very brand new development of 3-car garage, a gated planned community. And it was all Anglo, and the cars were Lexus and so on, SUVs. And what the perfect thing for me, just from a writerly perspective, because I was of course immediately interested in how proximate these two different worlds were in class and of course culture and ethnicity. And a guy who wound up serving as sort of the landlord of the trailer park to give it a better plumbing system. And he said, you know how these two communities are connected? Only in two ways. Some of the kids all go to the same school, so they take the school bus together, but they share a sewage pipe. So something about that story where I got to know kind of the norms in each pod, literally across the street from one another, that barely interact. In the trailer park, on the one hand, they had much more play, and the families are much more tight-knit, and they also didn't just rely on the nuclear family. There was much more of a sense of a coherent village structure with middle rings and outer rings of support. But then it was just interesting to learn, once these kids in the trailer park hit 13, especially the boys, none of them could afford to do things like join the Little League or Boy Scouts or these sort of volunteer, sort of associational aspects of American life that can take people through their youth to then say if they want to have a full college application. And so I think just sort of learning, where do we fail those who come here looking for sustained opportunity? And I've been thinking a lot, and I'm far from alone in this, but it's been really interesting for me in the last year as someone who I've struggled quite a bit to be an easy patriot throughout my life. I think it's just a factor of growing up overseas and even being a person of faith. It's just not my primary passionate allegiance always to the country. But I do get proud of this country when I think of the immigrant story and the immigrant narrative. And I think it's been interesting there's such a positive connotation, even if there's struggle, and there always is struggle in the immigrant narrative, there's such a positive, hopeful, forward-leaning thrust to America being an immigrant nation.
Yeah, I really struggle. Right now to think about what it would even mean to have a positive public display of religion that builds some kind of common ground or common good.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you noticing? Are there even any positive public displays of religion right now?
I think in terms of just sheer public messaging, public pronouncement, when people of faith, so-called, people speaking in the name of Christianity, are doing sort of signage, positioning, all of that, I think the witness, for the most part, has been disturbingly negative and only gotten more so. I feel very lucky because I don't quite know how this has happened, but vocationally and journalistically, I have somehow been drawn into waters throughout the country, actually, of doers who are in the sacred sector, but they're not, any sort of notion or posture of culture war is very foreign to them. These are people who are either, weavers in their communities. They're doing really creative and very real sort of racial justice work, or they're creating kind of different forms of hospitality and accompaniment, and they are going out to the margins. And I think there is, among other things, one of the gifts of religion is that it has, from the beginning of time, it is kind of an anthropological form that sort of understands how we were designed and how we were designed to be in relationship to one another, as well as how we were designed to grow into both competence and compassion. And so insofar as there are folks, some Christian, some Jewish, some Muslim, others, who are kind of downloading and infusing their institutions, often more familiar with sort of schools and hospitals, with some of the wisdom of a religious logic that understands how we need to create safe spaces to be able to be open about our mistakes or certain rituals or whatever. So because I get to be in that sort of practitioner world that is never on the television screen, I'm much more often hopeful. But when you see what's happened in this sort of toxic mix of nationalism and race, and I would say like nativism and not even theology, but like sort of a real spiritual confidence, I guess, that God himself is calling you to disbelieve. There was some pastor who said, I rebuke the news in the name of Jesus, And I was like, well, I'm not sure he'll be able to get rid of the news for you. But when you see stuff like this, and these are supposedly some of my own people, and I'm speaking now as a Christian, I think I'm probably in a moment of really soul searching, like what role do I play in all of this? And this weird mixture of forces. I do think there's something going on that is somehow inextricable from race right now, because my most hopeful, certainly the Christians that like keep me a Christian, make me think it's the real deal, are either practitioners who are very humble heroes out there who will rarely get the ear, certainly of the last White House. And that's both immigrant and Black. And I think, just as someone who was forged by Vietnamese Jesuits and Korean Presbyterians and Nigerian Pentecostals and so on, I think that those people have really shaped the sort of tenor of my actual Christianity. And so I think sometimes maybe it's irresponsible for me to do this, but if I'm going to choose who to spend time with in my free time, it's those folks, because they're the ones who I think are sort of I surely hope they're the future of the faith in this country.
Mm-hmm. It seems that the Christian community in the U.S. is divided on the issue of immigration. And I wonder, if you have any insights as to why that is, and if you want to say how that compares to other religious communities in the U.S., or just your reflection on that division.
Yeah. I confess I really don't understand this. Sometimes I feel like I'm like in the school of trying to get what American Christianity actually looks like. And as I'm learning more, there's something about the assumption of cultural dominance that, in my opinion, has been a kind of a cancer on the community of faith in this country, that has led to, I guess, fear of loss of status, fear of the outsider.
It strikes me that we're talking about practices as being what shows through as authentic right now, that practices and authentic faith practice is needed. That just comes to mind from what you're saying. And I wonder if in the immigration space, what kind of caring or hopeful faith practices have you seen, in the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, the word evangelical has become a four-letter word, and for many good reasons. But in many parts of the country still, a lot of folks who would identify as evangelical, say as an adjective, they are in many ways at both the forefront of and in most sustained commitment to serving refugees. In particular, Catholic nuns are sort of saving the border crisis in many ways. So in terms of kind of sustained commitment to those who just need accompaniment through the gateway of kind of a traumatic change, I do see people in organizations of faith being the ones who are actually most at the forefront a lot of the time. So that gives me hope, and that's sort of, I think, often an underreported fact.
Are there things we haven't talked about, things you think that the public is missing and it needs to hear?
Yeah. I live right now in DC, but right around us are, and this is actually similar to Houston and Minneapolis and a lot of, I think, parts of Nashville, like a lot of cities in the country where most of the immigrant communities are on the outskirts and in suburbs. And when a place like the New York Times or the Post or Fox News, CNN will cover immigration, they tend to focus on the policy debates. They focus on sort of the attitudes around the foreigner, one way or the other. And it kind of stops there. It's a justice issue, of course. But I'm always trying to encourage people, go out to these, we think of the suburbs as like lily white, but they're not anymore, a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And go out and try to figure out like, what are the internal newspapers or online sort of, if they're not physical newspapers, what is the information source? What are the cultural festivals? And this was actually very useful when I was reporting on different immigrant communities in Houston, to be a person of faith, even if I was going to a Buddhist temple or a Hindu service or whatever, to sort of at least be a person of faith myself, like gave me access. I was able to join a Korean Bible study, or I don't know, there was something about that intersection that just gives you texture into the sociology of the,
that's right,
how the mental maps are formed. And I very rarely see that covered in our journalism around this.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything about women's voices that you wanted to raise in particular? So are women of faith doing any distinctive things right now? Are there ways that women's voices need to be amplified more?
I do think there is a unique moment, especially when you talk about women of faith, when a nation or a society is feeling bruised, battered, broken, there's just extraordinary opportunity right now to sort of bring both a nurturing sensibility. But I often think women are just, as a former philosophy major, which was very esoteric and very male dominated, I always found the female professors and the few female students in the major to just be much more tangible. And there's a concreteness and a tangibility and then sort of an incarnationalism to get past a lot of our abstractions that seem to be sort of tearing us apart, actually on the emotional level. Like I just find women don't as naturally speak in terms of ideology. They speak more in terms of the person and relationship. And I just think women of faith in particular, I'll just speak for myself, my own experience dipping in and out of both highly secular sort of workplaces and then now more recently more sort of the faith world. You're probably always a little bit misunderstood. Mm-hmm. I don't think many of us easily fall into kind of left-right dogma. I'm generalizing here, but as I think about the gifts and the invitation for women of faith in particular in this moment, I think there are many.
Yeah, it's like we have been trained to care, and and to practice care well.
That's right.
And sometimes that's de-emphasized or made as if it's minimal, and right now it needs to lead.
That's right.
We need to be leaders of care.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I so admire you and your work, and
ditto, Elaine, ditto.
Well, that's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. Follow us on Twitter at RiceRPLP. Thanks to our guest, Ann Snyder. Today's show was written by Pamela Prickett, Rachel Schneider, and Haley Hemstreet. Our producers are 3 Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Elaine Howard Eklund. Until next time.